We've all heard that pets are incredibly loyal, but what if a pet actually gave its own life to make sure its owner's killer faced justice? Tonight, we're going back to Christmas Eve 2001 to a quiet neighborhood in Dallas, Texas. What started as a festive night ended in an absolute nightmare. A brutal crime scene with 0 human witnesses. But the killers made one critical mistake. They forgot about the 18-inch white-crested cockatoo sitting in the next room. And before that bird took its final breath, it made sure to leave a mark that would put its owner's killer in handcuffs. 48-year-old Kevin Butler lived alone in the Pleasant Grove neighborhood of southeast Dallas. He was a hard worker who ran a local swimming pool company. But to those who knew him best, Kevin was a guy with a massive heart. He frequently took in stray dogs and cats, giving them a second chance at life. But his absolute favorite companion was an 18-inch white-crested cockatoo named, simply, Bird. Kevin had taken Bird in 2 years prior after a former roommate had to move out. The bond between them was instant. Neighbors and family members noted that Bird was fiercely protective of Kevin. He was sweet to his owner, but he did not take kindly to strangers. If anyone got too close or seemed like a threat, Bird would immediately let them know. Unfortunately, on Christmas 24th, 2001, that protective instinct would be put to the ultimate test. It was getting late on Christmas Eve. Kevin was supposed to meet his best friend, Michael DiNardo, for dinner. But an hour passed at the restaurant and Kevin's seat remained empty. Michael tried calling his phone repeatedly, but every call went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like Kevin at all. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, Michael decided to skip dinner and drive over to Kevin's house to check up on him. When he pulled up into the driveway, his stomach dropped. Even though it was freezing cold and late at night, the front door of the house was wide open. The lights inside were blazing, and to make things stranger, Kevin's pickup truck, the one he drove every single day, was completely gone. Michael knew better than to walk into a dark house alone. He immediately dialed 911. When officers from the Dallas Police Department arrived, they walked through the front door and stepped into a scene of utter chaos. The entire house had been completely ransacked. Drawers were ripped out, papers were scattered across the floor, and furniture was overturned. It looked like a tornado had hit the living room, or rather, a violent, desperate struggle. That suspicion was confirmed when officers walked further into the room. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was Kevin Butler. His arms and legs were bound tightly with electrical cord. He had been severely beaten, his throat had been slashed, and his shirt was completely soaked through with blood from multiple stab wounds. It was a horrific personal attack. Whoever did this hadn't been in a rush. They had taken their time. But as detectives processed the gruesome scene, they discovered something else that was incredibly bizarre. Walking into the kitchen, officers found Bird. The cockatoo was lying motionless on the floor near the back wall. He was missing a leg. His wings were completely broken, and a small pool of blood had formed underneath him. A forensic exam would later reveal that the bird had been killed by a brutal stab wound to the back. But as the crime scene tech looked closer at the tiny animal, they noticed a striking detail. Even though he was dead, Bird's beak and claws were completely covered in human blood. Detectives looked around the kitchen and noticed a trail of white feathers running all across the house. Then they found a smear of blood on a light switch just a few feet from Kevin's body. They also found blood on the handles of 2 of the 4 knives recovered from the scene. When the lab ran the forensic testing, a shocking truth emerged. None of that blood belonged to Kevin, and none of it belonged to Bird. Whoever had walked into Kevin's house that night had walked out of it bleeding. Bird put up a hell of a fight. Lead investigator Detective Brett Malden now had the killer's DNA, but he didn't have a name. He began interviewing Kevin's neighbors, co-workers, and past employees. It didn't take long for a suspect to emerge. Several co-workers pointed toward a 22-year-old named Johnny Cerner. Cerner had recently been fired by Kevin after he was caught altering a company check. Cerner lived just a block behind Kevin's house with his 30-year-old half-brother, Daniel Torres. Detective Malden brought both brothers in for questioning. They completely denied being anywhere near the house on Christmas Eve. Since he didn't have enough to hold them, Malden took DNA cheek swabs from both men and sent them to the lab. Now, remember, this was 2002. DNA testing was still relatively new and took months. Finally, in July of 2002, the results came back, and it wasn't what anyone expected. The blood on the light switch, the knife handles, and most importantly, the blood on Bird's beak did not match Johnny Cerner. It was a perfect match for his brother, Daniel Torres. Confronted with the undeniable DNA evidence, Daniel Torres broke. He admitted that he and Johnny had been drinking in their yard when they decided to go to Kevin's house to get revenge for Johnny getting fired. Torres claimed Johnny was the one who attacked Kevin, but admitted during the struggle the cockatoo flew off his perch and went completely feral. In Torres's own words to detectives, the bird attacked him, pecking and scratching all over my head. In a panic, Torres grabbed a fork and a knife, stabbed him at the bird to make it stop. That was his undoing. By attacking the bird, Torres left his own blood right on the weapon that killed him. Johnny Cerner eventually confessed too, admitting they stole $1,200 and Kevin's truck. In February 2003, Daniel Torres stood trial. During closing arguments, prosecutor George West looked at the jury and said, "This bird spoke to us. We know this bird will attack anybody who's attacking his owner." Both Daniel Torres and Johnny Cerner were convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Bird gave his life defending his best friend that night. He couldn't speak human words, but through the DNA he extracted from the killer, he spoke loud and clear to the jury. If you found this story of ultimate pet loyalty incredible, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another true crime video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe out there. The next story. When a dog is spotted running loose through a quiet suburban neighborhood in the dead of night, most people just assume it slipped out of the backyard. They think it's a simple case of a lost pet. But in the early hours of a chilly September morning in South Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, a lone golden retriever sprinting down the pavement wasn't just lost. He was fleeing a house of horrors. He was the sole witness to a brutal, cold-blooded murder, and if it wasn't for his frantic midnight run, a highly dangerous killer would have vanished into thin air. This is the unbelievable story of a loyal dog named Joe and how he led the police straight to his master's killer. It was 3 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday morning. The streets of South Wilkes-Barre were completely dark and deserted. Suddenly, residents near Carey Avenue noticed something unusual: a beautiful golden retriever running down the middle of the street, completely alone. He looked panicked, breathing heavily, darting back and forth with nowhere left to go. Concerned citizens called the local police, reporting a stray dog wandering near a Turkey Hill mini-mart. Sergeant Joseph Ziegler was dispatched. When he pulled up, he found the dog inside the store, completely unharmed but visibly shaken. The officer checked the dog's collar and realized he was in luck. Engraved on the tag was the dog's name, Joe, alongside his owner's phone number and address, 14 Donald Court. It was only about half a mile away. Sergeant Ziegler figured this would be a routine find and return case. He dialed the number on the collar, expecting an anxious owner to pick up, but all he got was dead silence. Ziegler tried a second time, then a third. Every single call went straight to voicemail. It was nearing 4 a.m. by this point, so the officer assumed the owner was just a heavy sleeper. He loaded Joe into the back of his cruiser and drove over to 14 Donald Court. But the moment he pulled up to the house, Sergeant Ziegler's law enforcement instincts kicked into overdrive. The front door of the house was wide open, swaying slightly in the cold night breeze. And despite the ungodly hour, every single light inside the home was blazing. Ziegler wondered if the owner had realized Joe was missing and rushed out to find him, leaving the door open in a panic. He walked up to the porch, rang the doorbell, and knocked loudly on the frame. No answer. Just an eerie, heavy silence echoing from inside the house. Ziegler knew right then that this was no longer a routine animal control call. He stepped back and immediately radioed for backup. Within minutes, the quiet residential street was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. Officers set up yellow crime scene tape across the lawn as a team pushed past the front door. The moment they stepped into the entryway, they knew they were looking at a violent crime. The entire first floor was a disaster zone. The kitchen floor was littered with knocked-over items. The patio doors were wide open, and there were pools and spatters of blood smeared across the floorboards. But the true horror was waiting for them on the second floor. As detectives approached the master bedroom, the metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air. Lying face down next to a nightstand was a man. His shirt was completely saturated in deep crimson. Just a few feet away from his body lay an 8.5-inch bloody kitchen knife. The victim had been stabbed multiple times in his lower back. The state of the bedroom showed that he had fought desperately for his life before succumbing to his wounds. But as the forensics team looked closer, they found something even chilling. Sitting right next to the victim's body was a bright red can of gasoline. The killer hadn't just murdered him, they were planning to burn the entire house to ash to destroy the evidence. And they would have succeeded if Joe hadn't escaped and forced the police to intervene. The victim was identified as 58-year-old Fred Boot. Fred was a pillar of the local community and a loving father of 4 grown children. 3 years prior, his wife Erin had tragically passed away. To keep her memory alive, Fred had established a local arts scholarship in her name. He was a kind, welcoming man whose world revolved around his family and his two dogs, Mia and Joe. Now Fred was gone, and the hunt for his killer was officially on. The first massive break in the case came from Fred's son, Brian. Brian had also been trying to call his father that morning. When he couldn't get through, he used the Find My iPhone app to ping his dad's phone. The tracker showed that the phone wasn't at Donald Court. It was a few blocks away, pinging from a location on Willow Street. Aside from a single $20 bill, Fred's phone was the only thing stolen from the house. Roughly 12 hours after the body was found, a fire was reported in the basement of an apartment building on Moffett Street. When firefighters arrived, they discovered a pile of clothes and shoes burning in a shared basement. It was a clear case of arson. Police rushed to the scene and realized this building was just blocks away from where Fred's phone had been pinging. When they examined the half-burned sneakers in the fire, the tread pattern on the soles was an exact match to the bloody footprints lifted from Fred Booth's bedroom. The killer was panicking, desperately trying to burn away the physical evidence linking him to the crime. But he had already made another fatal mistake. Earlier that morning, surveillance cameras at a nearby hospital captured a man walking into the emergency room. His hands were badly sliced open and bleeding heavily. The exact type of injury an attacker gets when their grip slips on a knife during a violent stabbing. That same afternoon, a local woman walked into the police station to report her 14-year-old daughter, Luisa Reyes, missing. She stated that Luisa had run off with her older boyfriend, a 31-year-old man named Rinaldo Mercado. The boyfriend with the heavily bandaged hands. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with terrifying speed. Rinaldo Mercado lived in the exact Moffett Street apartment building where the bloody shoes were burned. Even more disturbing, his teenage girlfriend, Luisa, was the daughter of Fred Booth's ex-girlfriend. Luisa had actually lived in Fred's house before Fred ended the relationship. The motive was clear, a toxic mix of revenge, anger, and a botched robbery. By the time the police issued a warrant, Mercado and the teenage girl had already crossed state lines. They fled to West New York, New Jersey, planning to get emergency passports and catch a flight to the Dominican Republic. But Mercado couldn't keep his mouth shut. He bragged to his uncle about what he did, even pulling up the local Pennsylvania news headlines on his phone to prove he killed Fred Booth. His uncle, disgusted by the crime, immediately called the cops. The next day, U.S. Marshals and local police swarmed the area and placed Mercado in handcuffs. In 2020, Rinaldo Mercado was convicted on all counts, including first-degree murder, arson, and robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite being 14, Luisa Reyes was tried as an adult, taking a plea deal that put her behind bars for 40 years. Following the trial, Joe the Golden Retriever finally went to his permanent home with Fred's son, Brian. He was safe, loved, and surrounded by family. And the scholarship Fred had originally set up for his late wife was officially renamed the Fred and Erin Booth Scholarship for the Arts. Human beings can harbor malice and deceit, but dogs possess a purity of loyalty that can alter the course of justice. If Joe hadn't made that frantic run into the midnight darkness, a killer might have walked free forever. If you were moved by Joe's incredible loyalty, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another true crime story. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes open and stay safe. The next story. In the world of true crime, we often see killers go to extreme lengths to wipe away forensic evidence. They scrub down rooms, destroy surveillance footage, and make sure no human eyes are left to tell the tale. They think they've committed the perfect crime. But nature has a strange way of holding a mirror up to humanity's darkest moments. In December of 2018, inside a cramped wooden loft in San Fernando, Argentina, a brutal murder took place. There were no cameras, there were no human witnesses, but sitting in the corner of that dark room was a tiny green parrot. And before the night was over, that bird would unconsciously record the victim's final, desperate cries for help, becoming the most chilling piece of evidence in the entire case. It was roughly 6 a.m. on December 30th, 2018, when a local man named Miguel Roland frantically called 911. Roland told dispatchers that he had just returned home from his overnight shift at a local rugby club, only to find his partner dead in her bedroom. When police officers arrived at House 27 on the corner of Boedo and Garaditi streets, they climbed up to the wooden loft and stepped into utter chaos. Mattresses were ripped off the bed frames, and personal belongings were violently scattered across the floor. In the middle of the room lay the body of 46-year-old Elizabeth Toledo, known to her friends as Ellie. She had been brutally beaten, leaving severe bruising across her face and body. While waiting for the forensics team to arrive, a lone officer was stationed inside the room to guard the crime scene. The room was completely silent. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced through the quiet loft. A woman's voice shrieked in absolute terror, "Oh, please let me go! Oh, no!" The officer's heart stopped. He spun around, hand on his holster, expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but the room was empty. Then the scream happened again. This time, the officer traced the sound to a cage hanging near the wall. Inside was a green parrot, shrieking those exact words at the top of its lungs.
The victim, Ellie, suffered from a moderate intellectual disability. She was a gentle, vulnerable soul who mostly kept to herself. Her absolute favorite companion in the world was her pet parrot, whom she had raised from a chick and named Patchouli. Ellie spent hours talking to Patchouli every day. Because parrots are natural mimics, Patchouli easily picked up the phrases, pitch, and tone of Ellie's voice. But Ellie didn't live alone in that house. She shared the space with 3 men. One was her partner, Roland. The second was a 64-year-old man named Jorge Alvarez, known around the neighborhood as Tio George. The third roommate had actually been kicked out of the house by the landlord just 2 weeks prior, specifically because he was caught physically abusing Ellie. When prosecutor Bibiana Santella took over the case for the local gender violence unit, she immediately had all 3 men brought in for questioning. The third roommate was quickly cleared with a rock-solid alibi. That left Roland and Jorge Alvarez. As detectives built their case, the officer who guarded the crime scene came forward with his report. He explained the terrifying moment he heard the parrot screaming Ellie's exact words, "Please let me go." Prosecutor Santella didn't dismiss it. She officially entered the parrot's screams into the case file as forensic evidence.
Soon after, a local shopkeeper who used to sell Ellie birdseed came forward with another chilling detail. She told investigators that a few weeks before the murder, she had visited the house and heard Patchouli repeat a completely different phrase, "Why did you hit me?" That detail changed how investigators viewed the entire case. You see, for a parrot to memorize a complex sentence, it doesn't just hear it once. It needs to hear that exact phrase repeated over and over again in the exact same emotional tone. This meant that what the police heard on the morning of the crime wasn't just a recording of Ellie's final moments, it was a recording of her daily life. It was proof that Ellie had been living in a domestic hell, trapped in that loft, begging for her safety for weeks before her life was finally taken.
While Patchouli provided the emotional truth of what happened inside that loft, investigators still needed hard, physical evidence to secure a conviction in court. That evidence came from the autopsy report delivered by Dr. Federico Corazon. The medical examiner confirmed that Ellie had been brutally assaulted, beaten multiple times, and ultimately manually strangled to death. Crucially, the biological evidence collected from the crime scene gave detectives a perfect genetic profile. The DNA did not match her partner, Roland. It belonged entirely to the 64-year-old roommate, Jorge Tio George Alvarez. To make matters worse for Alvarez, an eyewitness came forward stating they saw him entering and leaving the house right around the estimated time of the murder. And just 10 days after the crime, an acquaintance of Alvarez walked into the police station. He told detectives that Alvarez had actually confessed to him, callously claiming he thought he could get away with it because Ellie was too vulnerable to fight back. But he didn't count on Patchouli. When the case finally went to trial, the prosecution presented a flawless combination of modern DNA science and the chilling behavioral evidence of the pet parrot. While Patchouli couldn't legally be put on a witness stand, the testimony of the police officer and the neighbors who heard the bird mimicking Ellie's terror weighed heavily on the court. It painted a picture of a defenseless woman who had been systematically terrorized by the very people who were supposed to share her home. In the end, the court found Jorge Alvarez guilty of aggravated sexual assault and femicide. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Roland was ultimately acquitted due to a lack of direct evidence linking him to the final attack. As for Patchouli, he was taken in by one of Ellie's surviving sisters after the trial ended. It's never been reported whether he ever screamed those tragic words again, but for the rest of his life, he carried the only real audio recording of what Ellie's final weeks sounded like inside that lonely loft. The killers thought Ellie was completely isolated, believing no one would ever speak up for her. They completely underestimated the loyalty of a pet. Patchouli made sure her voice was heard, even from inside a cage. If Ellie and Patchouli's story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. Let me know your thoughts on this incredible case in the comments below. Until next time, take care of each other and stay safe.